similar kind of incident.
Well, let's hope you don't.
I hope so as well, or I hope not to. The Lord be with you. Dear Lord, we lift up those things that weigh on our hearts, particularly for Carter still.
He's doing fine.
He's fine. He's good.
Oh, good. Oh, and we thank you for the healing that you bring into our lives. Bless our conversations and fill our spirits. And may we become like those that we read that walk with God. Amen. So, Anne, I'm going to give you a little introduction because there's this colorful mess right here.
Okay.
So we spent 2 weeks talking about this, and we have referred back to it about every other time.
Okay.
But essentially, Genesis and in the first 5 books, or at least like Genesis and Exodus, there is 2 main components that scholars think that it was written from. And we call one of those the priestly, and one of those the non-priestly. And they are kind of laid and interwoven together. And so oftentimes in Genesis, you'll actually get 2 accounts of different stories.
Oh.
And so like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are like, you have 2 versions of creation. And they're from the different sources. And then you have Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 are 2 genealogies from the different sources. And then like the flood narrative is interwoven. And you get other things that repeat. I like to color code when we read to do that. And I do it for a few reasons. One of it, sometimes I think people go way overboard and it's just silly. And I think there's some parts like that today that are just silly when they'll cut out like one word in a sentence. And like that's the editor added that sentence because it doesn't belong here. The other part that I do that is sometimes it's very helpful. And so we'll see that in today's, there's one chapter that's all blue, and that blue is the priestly. And we'll notice when we read that part, it actually does read differently. They were written at different times, and they use different language for things, the syntax and grammar. In Hebrew, it's very clear that they're different. But sometimes in English, you can see the differences. And it helps us know, too, when we're reading a passage, if it's priestly or non-priestly, it helps us kind of interpret that passage a little better as well. There is also something new we have done. So the non-priestly also has multiple sources within it. and those are from different regions in Israel. And the non-priestly is older. It's like it's the oldest text. One of them we call the Elohist, and one we call the Yahweh, or the Yahwist. And most of Genesis so far has been the Yahweh source. But then, I think last week was actually our first time we saw something from the Elohist source. And Genesis will start being more Elohist, and Exodus is like all Elohist. And there's some different, they have different interpretations, they kind of focus on different parts of God. So sometimes God's more ethereal and up there. Other times God's with you and touches things and walks, and it's more anthropomorphic. So those kind of differences happen, but it's not too scary. Was that overwhelming? Clear as mud?
Just a start.
Mostly you can ignore it. And I think most of it's kind of silly when people make the differences. But the reason I brought it up in this class and why it's important to look at some of these doubles, and we'll look at it here in a moment, and we've talked about it in Acts, is a chiasm. Do you remember so a chiasm, it's like this poetic thing that makes a pyramid. And so you repeat stuff, it'd be A, B, C, B, A. And that middle becomes the focus. And so in all of Abraham's story, which we're going to finish this morning, has been this big chiasm. It's like my next 2 or 3 slides. So we'll see this chiasm. Is this pointed?
You're good.
Good. Okay, all right. Well, I'm sorry for missing last week. We were going to finish Abraham's story, and it would have been so amazing, and we'll get a glimpse of that today. But we're still going to finish Abraham's story. And if you remember where we were in those generations, the Toldos, our last slide, we're going to look back at those generations. So that's that 10 kind of segments that is an outline of Genesis. we are going to finish today the Toldos, or the generations of Terah, which is Abraham's grandfather. And we are going to then move on to the generations of Isaac next week. Before we kind of start looking, I don't want to go here yet. Oh, where'd my... Okay, what has been your favorite part of Abraham so far? Including what we're going to cover today.
He's going to sacrifice his son.
That's your favorite part?
Yeah, because it didn't happen.
Oh, because it didn't? Okay, I was like,
I mean, it's testing Abraham to the end.
Very much so. Does that speak to you?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I mean, I wouldn't do that to my son. I'm sorry. But it shows I think the significance of Abraham and the relationship with God. And Abraham's trust of God that he would do that.
Yeah, so there is so if you want fun, when you come to read that story, read different Jewish interpretations of it. One thing I love about Jewish commentaries, and I've talked about that idea of wrestling before, like everything is these circles. And so the Torah is the beginning or the law, those first 5 books. And you get bigger with the prophets and bigger with the writings. And then they have a whole canonized commentary that we could call the Midrash. And that it just means to wrestle. And in a lot of these commentaries and stories, they make up a story about these other stories to help you understand it in new ways. Some of my favorite with these ones about Abraham and Isaac is Abraham actually does kill Isaac, and Isaac is then resurrected. And the reason they'll tell these different stories, and they're different ones, there's different versions, is it helps me know maybe that's what Abraham believed would happen. And so he would go through with it because he believed Isaac would be risen, because he had that much faith. Not that he didn't want Isaac to die, but he had faith that God would bring him back, and still, because he was the promised son. I got little goosebumps when I said that, because
that's the promised son.
Yes, yeah. Well, because there's no way he could be dead. That doesn't make sense. And so obviously God will raise him up. But think about that for us as promised children of God and our baptisms. It's special. Anything else stand out while we read through so far, even the weeks past?
I find that this slave lady that Abraham got pregnant,
Hagar,
and what was his son's name?
Ishmael.
Ishmael goes big into the Arab world.
Yeah.
And I read in it that Ishmael's supposedly buried at the Kaaba. And he got both there in Mecca, and that's what the Islam faith is all about.
And so the Kaaba is this square, and originally it was understood to be after Sarah dies, Abraham goes back to be with Hagar, and this is the Islamic version of Abraham's story. So he goes back and he is buried there with Ishmael, that place becomes a shrine of idols, and that's what led to the lies of Islam, was to purify those
Is there
idols.
a relationship?
This says he married somebody else.
Yes, and this is where we'll start to differ. I actually mentioned this when we talked about Hagar. Some say who we're going to mention today is Hagar, and they have more sons.
Is there a relationship between Ishmael and Muhammad?
So Ishmael would be understood, and has traditionally been understood in medieval times, to be the father of the Arabs, just like we would look at Abraham as the father of the Jews. And then these other ones that are mentioned, like Lot, would be the father of the 2 families that we look, the Midianites and the Ammonites. And so you could almost say like Muhammad is a son of Ishmael. But in here it talks about there's 12 Arab tribes, and he is these 12 princes come from Ishmael. If you can track that genealogy back, I would be really surprised. But
We'll make it up.
It's a good story.
Any other parts that stood out here? I like Abraham's story. I'll go back to my favorite is that War of the 5 Kings, and that part with Melchizedek, that priest king that comes out. That's this picture of Jesus. I love that part. And what I love about an Abraham story, so if you remember we talked about Genesis 1 through 11, we're like this cosmic view. We call it the primeval history, but we're zooming in. So as we move along, we zoom more and more in on one family. And what we tend to think is that, well, God's not working anywhere else. It's only in Abraham's family. And I love these moments that pop up where God's still working in other places. Melchizedek is one of those. He pops up. There's a whole city worshiping God. And we're going to see some more today that I'll wait to get to until we get with that. But these promises to Ishmael is like a continuation. God is still working in other places. God still has love for other people. It's not that God loved one people and not the rest.
Well, a good example of that is that ritual where they're looking for a suitable spouse. And they ultimately identify Rebecca.
Yeah.
Even though, the whole thing is almost comical the way they go about it. But in a sense, it's also prophetic.
Yeah.
And I just enjoyed reading that part. I think that's in 24.
It's the last part.
Yeah.
I almost wanted to say, so like as we've gone through Genesis, there's been this theme of those who walk with God. And it's almost like Isaac and Rebekah are a clean slate. Like Abraham wasn't really a good guy. Like he and Sarah made a lot of mistakes. And Isaac and Rebekah kind of become like, they're pretty pure in a sense. Like they're pure. Like Rebecca is introduced as a woman who is walking with God, but it doesn't use that language, so I didn't put it in the slides. But I was like, this is almost like, God picked Abraham out of the chaos, and out of that we're seeing this new, clean family to begin again. Almost like they're an Adam and Eve sort of thing.
I'm glad you said that this is showing us that God is working in other parts of the world, because I think a lot of people do concentrate on that. And if you're not this person, you're separated from God. And I don't believe that. So I'm glad you say that.
I like these glimpses where we see, and one thing to note too, we looked at this in Genesis 10, that table of nations, if you remember. We talked about there were 70 nations. And there is this idea that for Jews and for others as well, like in Islam in particular, which is special with the Quran, but like the world is divided into 70, and there's an angel of God over each people group. And in Islam, everyone, I don't know why we're talking, you've got me on thinking about Islam now. Let me stop talking about Islam. But the Jews had this idea that there was, like God had appointed 70 angels over the 70 peoples. They were just the most special. All right, let's look at our chiasm. So this is where we've kind of been walking through this Abraham story, and there's lots of repetitions that happen. And so if you remember at first, there's this testing of faith with Abraham. Today we're going to see the complement with the testing of faith. And then we're going to see a really tiny genealogy, but it's like that tiny genealogy that begins the section. So we're finishing this chiasm today. Last week we looked at the sister fib part 2. But here we're gonna come back to a testing of faith. We're gonna come back to a genealogy. And if you remember, in the middle of Abraham's whole story, so kind of the point, it's Genesis 15 through 17. That's the two covenants are given. So there's the covenant where they cut the pieces in half, and then the covenant where they cut the foreskins off. So there's two reminders of the covenant, and in the middle is that story with Hagar and Ishmael out in the wilderness, where God is, she says, God hears me, and then they name Ishmael, God sees me. And so there's this idea that God is very merciful and loving, not just to Abraham and Isaac, but to all peoples as well, all those who hurt. But let's look. I just wanted to review, because we're going to move out of Abraham, and we won't go as much detail. As we walked through Abraham's story, we remember Abraham was called. He went to Egypt. He is with Lot, and they get separated. And God makes this promise that I will keep my covenant with you. My promise is with you, and you will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And then there's that favorite part that I love, the War of the Five Kings, where all the kings of Babylon come out and attack Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham wins with his little tiny militia. He defeats all of the Eastern empires. And then we moved on to what we just mentioned. There's that covenant of pieces where they cut the animals in half. And that was special because this was a traditional covenant ritual that usually both parties would pass through. And they say, if I break that covenant, may I be as one of these animals dead. But for Abraham and God, God is the only one who goes through the pieces. So God is saying, Abraham, you can't break this covenant. I am committed to you. That story of Hagar and Ishmael, and then again, that covenant with the picture of circumcision. And then last week, we looked at the 3 visitors that came to visit Abraham under the tree, and that weird episode about Sodom and Gomorrah, and then that just outrageous story about Lot and his 2 daughters. If you remember that, the 2 daughters get Lot drunk, and then they sleep with him, and they both get pregnant, and it's because they think it's the end of the world. And there's 2 family groups that come out of that, and I brought my chart again that we can look at that genealogy. But from that comes the Midianites. Oh, sorry, no. Let's see. Let me follow the. So the Moabites and the Ammonites come from them. And we talked how there's a little bit of racism kind of snuck in there because it's saying like you people over there are sons of incest. Yeah, you're nasty. So if I'm going to come conquer you, I have a right because look at your parentage.
Make you slaves or any of that.
We're gonna conquer you, enslave you. It's okay because you're not the same equal human as I am. We're gonna see more of that today. We'll sneak in some more. And then there was the sister fib part 2. And if you remember when we talked about that, he goes and meets with Abimelech. And it's like the exact same story that happens when Abram and Sarah went to Egypt. And they lied about him being about Sarah being Abraham's sister, but actually they're married. And we also talked about how the story, like Isaac does a similar thing with Rebekah, and that in the chronology, Isaac's story is probably written first. And these parts about Abraham are actually pointing forward to this kind of moment with Isaac. All right, we haven't read through a lot of these, but we are going to read some sections of the parts today. Before we do that, any questions from today's reading that stood out to you? Any parts we want to look over besides sacrifices?
Go on.
I looked up why they put the hand under the thigh.
Oh, yes.
It was weird.
Yes, it is. It's going to make it in our slides. No pictures, but what'd you find out?
Well, there was some disagreement. Some said it means grabbing the testicles. Some others think it means grabbing the penis, because that's, if you grab somebody's most intimate parts, that means you really are truly swearing that I will do it.
Okay. I wasn't going to go into that much detail, but yeah, this is a euphemism where someone would go up under their like little cloak thing, and it was a way of making a promise. But yeah, it has to do with being intimate, and you are really swearing when you do this. And this is when Abraham swears to his servant, who they just call him the servant for a lot of the time. It's Eleazar. And he is making this promise that Eleazar will go and get a wife for Isaac. That is from Abraham's country, not a Canaanite. And that's what the promise is, that he won't marry a Canaanite. Really good.
One thing that struck me a little bit was that there's very little about Abraham's grieving process after Sarah died.
We get some more women though, so I guess they're not in short supply. That is true. I've not quite thought about that. There is well, I'll wait to talk about when she's buried. I spent too much time studying that part because it's kind of weird. That is true. There is not a lot of sense of mourning. And I'll refer back to what I said earlier. Isaac and Rebekah are kind of the special couple of the patriarchs. They're the only one that says Isaac loved Rebekah. There's this sense that they had intimacy where that's not really with the other patriarchs.
I'm not surprised that Abraham didn't didn't grieve as much, because it's a cruel world back then.
Yeah.
People are dying all the time, and I mean, it's not like we are now. And if it happens all the time, you kind of come to expect it. I think it kind of would harden you from that. I mean, look at all the wars and the people that died and diseases and all that. It's just a hard way of life. So, yeah, she died, but, you know.
Plus her age.
Yeah, that's her.
Yeah.
Hopefully she lived a good life.
Yeah.
She had plenty of time to
She
do it.
did plenty of time.
105 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, or something. It's in the hundreds.
All right, I wanted to not go there. I wanted to read, or not me read, but someone to read just this first part, so that first paragraph. So, Bill, if you would want to read maybe the first verse, and then Donna can read the second verse, and we'll work our way down.
The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah had borne him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who will ever have said to Abraham that Sarah could nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
So you will notice, and I'm just going to draw one attention about the green and the blue. It seems really weird how it's so choppy back and forth. But that first green, it says the Lord dealt with Sarah, and first God says here, where then in the priestly, in the blue, it says the same thing, but God now has promised and not said. That's one reason people make this distinction. There's different words used in different sources. And so when it's compiled together, they're taking that line from the first one and then the line from the second of it, the second version of it. And same thing with the green, like in the blue. They're just trading back and forth. You can kind of see how it's repeating it. It's the same line, said more than once. I want to read this part because circumcision is important for Jews, and circumcision happens on the 8th day. And this is the first time covenant circumcision really takes place in the way circumcision is supposed to be. So you could almost think of Isaac as the first Jew. Abraham and Ishmael, they were circumcised, and the rest of Abraham's household, but they were older, not as a baby. So this is the first time really the covenant is taking shape as it's supposed to take shape.
So before that, men were circumcised when they were adults?
In this story, back in chapter 7, in chapter 17, God introduces the covenant of circumcision, but Abraham is old, and Ishmael is old, and the whole household is, like, they're not babies.
Okay, now I don't remember, did it say why?
Why, what?
Why, did the Lord say why that men should be circumcised?
It's a picture of covenant, and circumcision wasn't unique to Jews. Other cultures did it too, but it's a significant and pretty telling way. That's not going to significantly change your life.
I lived in Africa for 2 years, and when the boys would become men, they went to what was called circumcision school. Mm-hmm. And they actually took them up in the mountains and circumcised them. And that was a sign that the boy could then marry. He's a man who could marry. And it did the same with the girls. They took them up and took a stick and opened them up. Mm-hmm. And then when they came back, they were adults and they could have kids. They did it. I mean, they were having kids at 14 and 16, but that was, in a way, it was really good because the whole village recognized them. We don't have that. You kind of have to feel your way out and figure out, am I a man? Not a man. Or where that happens. There, it's very formal, and everybody recognizes, which I thought was good.
Except
almost like a purpose.
People don't mature at the same age.
It didn't matter. When they were 14.
Right,
all-
but I'm just saying, in reality,
Yeah.
people don't mature at the same age. So if you say 14, some have matured, some maybe haven't matured.
Yeah, well, it's what they did, and they came at night, and they took the boys away, and they went to them to the mountains, and the elders taught them the ways of the tribe,
Uh-huh.
and fighting, and well, they had to have horse, and what their responsibilities were.
That's interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up. I didn't know that was. I'll just say for Don, I find it fascinating how you're like, but the individual might not mature at the same rate, and it's like, but the community. This is when you're a man. That's one of those different mindsets of communal versus individualistic.
I was not
Not
very
exactly
good.
the sexual part, but the division, because I know some 30-year-old babies.
Well, I know when I
Or older.
decided I was an adult, when my parents came down, and I stayed in a hotel room with them, and there was a baby crib in the bed. They would ask for a rollaway, and it was a baby crib.
Where were you when this happened?
I was in Africa.
Okay, well, I just wanted you to
Yeah,
tell me.
I was in Cape Town.
You weren't in the
And
hospital.
no, my folks came to visit, and I talked about up to where I was there, and I just laughed. And I said, I'm not a baby anymore. I'm in a regular bed. It was just a term. That was my,
Misunderstood.
yeah.
I wonder how scary it was for the children to have to go up to the mountain at night. I wonder if that was traumatic or something they were excited
expected it.
about.
Well, if they
You know,
weren't with
they did it.
everybody else, yeah, if they weren't with
Parents.
everybody else, that's just kind of what one did.
Parents supported it. They knew they were
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be scary to me. So, all the other times we've done the overview, I've said this section of Genesis continues the Abraham cycle. Now it says we conclude the Abraham cycle. We are finishing Abraham's section. Today we will be done with Abraham. We will move on to Isaac. The first kind of part that we're going to see is that birth of Isaac. We just kind of mentioned it. We'll look at it more in detail the next slide. And the casting out of Ishmael. I put them in the same slide because there wasn't too much to say about the birth of Isaac. And then we're going to see Abraham and Abimelech again. I wanted that to alliterate. And that's because we just saw them last time, but then they're going to meet again, and there's some significance that's going to happen here. And the next chapter, we're going to see, I called it the sacrifice of Isaac, which I now realize was probably not the best phrase to call it, and I think it's because I had that Jewish commentary in mind. Most of your Bibles might say the binding of Isaac or the testing of Abraham. I think the testing of Abraham would be a better title. But, and then we're going to have this little segment about genealogy. Chapter 23, we're going to see the death of Sarah. Not too much emotion is going to happen there. And then chapter 24, we're going to see Isaac and Rebekah. And it'll be cool when we get to that part. So let's start off with this part, the birth of Isaac. Again, this is the first time covenant circumcision is happening as it's supposed to be on that 8th day. So we're seeing this new way of living, this new people God has made. It's beginning to take shape. And I just want to call back as a reminder, Isaac's name has something to do with laughter. And I just put here it means laughing, because the Hebrew is unclear if Isaac is causing people to laugh in the sense of it's joyous, or is he being laughed at, like people are laughing at Sarah, or is it like they're laughing because it's ridiculous that an old lady could have a child? And if you remember before, like there's all these instances of laughing in the chapters before, they've all laughed for different reasons. And most of the time, Sarah was laughing because it's ridiculous. I'm in my 90s, I can't have a baby. Now, though, she's laughing with joy. And so she names him Isaac again because others will laugh with her. And again, it's unclear if it's a joyous laughter or a making fun of laughter, but there's laughing. And I like to think it's a joyous laughter.
Yeah, me too.
But because of this, there are some tensions that take place. And we mentioned this before we got into Abraham's story. We as Americans, when we're told something, we like to have a list of what's right and what's wrong. And you can put a little checkbox and it's very clear. The ancient way of writing is different than that. And so sometimes you'll have long ways of writing that's still teaching you right and wrong or good and bad, but it doesn't explicitly say this thing is bad. But what we're going to see again and again and again is that polygamy causes problems. When you have more than one wife and you have kids from different moms, it causes issues. And we're seeing that tension take place. And part to keep in mind is that Genesis is one of the last books written of the Old Testament. And so we tend to think of it as being one of the first books, but it's one of the last things that are written right as after the temple has been built. And the Romans were like, or not the Romans, the Persian Empire was like, you guys are fighting, you need to find a good origin story to bring yourselves together. And that's why we have all these sources kind of compiled. And so this is still teaching us a way about marriage as it was understood in that day, in like 400 or 600 BC. And the other part, and I really love this, as you read kind of through the rest of this chapter, Ishmael is not going out in shame. Ishmael is going out blessed. And there is promises made to Ishmael from God that he also will be a great nation. Yeah. And remember his name, like it's God hears and God sees. What I've really come to love Hagar and Ishmael as we've walked through with them together, just because they are a picture of those who are cast out. And we're reminded in them that God still has love and compassion for those that are easily forgotten. And God's blessing still goes with them, just like it is with Isaac, though he's not the covenant son. Does that kind of make sense? And I just think that's special. And I have looked over Hagar and Ishmael too much before, and I'm really starting to see their kind of significance in the story, and that I think it's really, there is a focus that they stand out as a different people. Another thing to know, just like we're going to see with Isaac, and there was an emphasis that he gets a wife from Abraham's family, there's an emphasis from Hagar that Ishmael gets a wife from Egypt. And remember, as we looked at, that is where Hagar is from. She is from Egypt. So we're seeing these two kind of family paths take different ways. Oh, there was something I forgot to say. Oh, okay, cool. So there is a lot of play on words that happen here between Ishmael and between Isaac. And some of the words are like strange Hebrew idiomisms. Like it doesn't call them child, it's like lad. Like if I start saying lad when I'm talking about kids, it would sound funny. That's what happens here in Hebrew when it describes their age. And there's some other things that keep popping up, like the similarities with the wife and the things, but Abraham and Isaac are really put in parallel together. And it's almost like we're seeing two covenant kind of places take, even though the special covenant is with Isaac, there was also a covenant happening with Ishmael that God has made with him. Yeah, and there's a bunch of other parallels, but I don't want to, that's too much time for not really that important. But there is promises that God makes to Ishmael. He is not going out in shame, as I said before. And there's some other funny Hebrew things. Oh, here's a picture. I got the time machine and went back there to the Renaissance, and I grabbed this picture. And so here's Hagar going out there with him, and you'll notice Ishmael's a little older. Sometimes he's like a teenager. Other times he's a little boy. Sometimes he's an adult. We don't really know how old he was, but there he goes. And you'll notice there's some other guys in the background. I could not find commentary on this painting, but I'm wanting to think that's like the servants and they're kind of gossiping about it or something like that. I'm not sure. But there we go. There's Ishmael. He's going away, and we are going to come back to him briefly, but he's kind of gone from our story now.
You know, in that time frame, whoever paid to have that painting done, that could be one of the...
Oh, that could be, yeah. This one's actually from the early 1900s. It looks like a Renaissance
Those
painting.
two may be part of history, but they also may be part of the patronage.
Oh, that makes sense.
Who did that.
Well, that's kind of cool. Thank you for telling me that. I could not find...
I don't know about that specifically,
Yeah.
but I know that was that.
I don't think this was a very famous one. It was just a copyright-free one, and I couldn't find anything to read about it. Before we move to the next chapter, does anyone want to add any things about this part with Ishmael or Hagar? Okay. Well, goodbye,
Ishmael.
Ishmael. We'll see you at the Kabbalah. So then we come to chapter 21, and we're going to come to see Abimelech again. Oh, wait. Is this... Did I mislabel mine? I think this is chapter 22. Did I miss something up here? Oh, no, this is just the second part of chapter 21. Okay, there we go. All right, I got confused. So this is the rest of chapter 21. So Abraham comes back to Abimelech, and they make this covenant together. This has some significance. Sometimes, like when Abraham went to the king in Egypt, they were not friends. And if you remember, we talked about that is it's like a retelling of the Exodus. They go out and they take gold and they steal everything from Egypt. And then Abraham and Egypt are not friends after this point. Abraham has a different relationship with Abimelech. Even last time, they're kind of blessed. There's a blessing between them, a friendship. And here they come back, and there is a covenant. And there's some significance here. It's in Hebron, which I think here we go. Here's our picture of, remember there's Sodom and Gomorrah over there, but they're under the water now. But Hebron is up here. And this is where Abraham seems to be hanging out the most here in Mamre. That's where he was last time, under that tree. So he kind of lives over here in this region over here. But suddenly he has found himself down here in Hebron. And I want to make a note because Abimelech's over here in Gerar, or however you say this. And that is a Philistine town. But the Philistines in Gerar did not exist yet. And so there's a little bit of some anachronism that's taking place. We're also later going to meet the Hittites, and they don't live yet. They're not here yet, too. And so I just want to point that out, because the Philistines were a sea people that traveled from like Greece and the Mediterranean, and they came and conquered the coastal areas. But they haven't done that yet. But we're talking about Philistines and Philistine towns, so it's kind of funny. But there is some significance. They come to Hebron and they name Hebron. It might mean the well of Oph or the well of seven. And remember we talked about 7 is this special number. It's like the number of perfection and things like that. But there's some significance here. Abraham is making peace with the residents of the land. And he makes an oath here, and he is given the well at Hebron. It's Abraham's well. And that gives us some significance, and we'll see more of this when Sarah is buried, but it gives him ownership and a claim to the land. And that's going to come back and be important when the Israelites come back into the land. Because here, he is given legal ownership of this well and of the region around the well. And so he has a claim. He belongs here now. This is his land. He's not just a visitor or a foreigner. This is his legally. It's been given to him by a king. So it's important. And that seems to be most of what this little part of this covenant is about. It gives him a stake in the land. But here they are in the Philistine. He's given this well up here at Hebron. Sorry, at Beersheba. We're not at Hebron yet. The well is down here in Beersheba. We're going to come back to Hebron. We're not there yet. He's down here. Sorry, I was mistaken there. And here's the well right here. You can go visit it today. It's Abraham's well. That might be it. It might not be. I did want to say this. There is a name given here called El Olam, which is God Almighty. And there is, or the everlasting God is how other translations might say it. So this is cool. Do you remember if you've read through like the book of Samuel or Chronicles or Kings, and it talks about all these high places or religious sites with these little gods? Does that ring any bells to you? So if you remember, the Canaanite people had lived there for a very long time, and every mountain or different regions might have a different kind of local god. There is some idea that there is another god here called El Olam. El just kind of means God. And this is almost like saying, well, that God, that's our God. that's kind of claiming this historic place with a historic God that's been here. It's saying, no, that's Yahweh, is the God over all places. I just want to throw that little line in there. We're going to visit some cities, and God has all these different names in those cities. And some of that might be that's the God of that land, and they're saying that's Yahweh. There's not all these other gods. And remember that the Philistines aren't here yet, so there's a little bit of anachronism there. Any questions on that part? Okay. Chapter 22, this is when we're going to come to the sacrifice of Isaac. Just because this is a weird passage, I wanted to read it together. Do you want to read it? Or would you rather just talk about it?
I'm fine talking about it.
Does anyone want to read it? Just so it kind of is a little fresh in our ears. Does anyone not want to read it? Are you okay with reading it? Okay. John, if you could start us off. And let's read it, and when you feel so called to stop reading, the next person can begin reading. So Denise will work our way around.
I just noticed there's a woodpecker pecking on that fence.
I saw a woodpecker in my neighbor's gutter pecking on his roof, like up underneath it yesterday, and I was like, should I let him know? Like, will he know? I'm like, I don't know what I can do about it.
Stop it.
Like,
a big hole.
Yes, he has.
yeah, John, if you could begin, please.
After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had showed him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. Next.
When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram, caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of the son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.
You want the next one, or you want to talk about that?
No, we're gonna go through. Yeah.
Okay. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offering shall possess the gate of their enemies. And your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessings for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba.
Okay, then we'll stop there. One little note. I have this weird green bulb thing that looked better on the computer than it does printed out. That is a new source that I added in. There is lots of different sources that people have, and I try to only put the main ones, but this one I thought was kind of significant. So there is a source that is the Yahwist and the Elohist that has been compiled together and done by a redactor and an editor, and that's what this one is. And so usually we can just say all of these are non-priestly. Anything that's not like there's priestly and non-priestly, it's still just a non-priestly source because you can get really complicated with it. I wanted to put it in there just because why not? So this is the sacrifice of Isaac. Was there a line or a phrase or anything that you noticed that may have stood out to you?
I thought it was interesting, he brought fire.
He brings fire. He knows what a sacrifice means. Yeah.
But either he has like flint and steel, or he has something smoldering or something. I haven't quite figured out what that was. But I thought that
I'd say he was probably pretty good at starting fires fresh. Maybe better than... I used to go backpacking with my dad, and we would have competitions in the morning who could start the fire with no match. And you could just try to find one little ember, and I was not very good at it. But yeah, so he brings up fire. What about, notice anything that he says?
I noticed Isaac says, "Where is the lamb?"
Whereas also Isaac is carrying the wood, so he's aware enough. He's not a little kid. He's older. Did you notice something Abraham says, maybe in the very beginning?
Here I am.
Here I am. This phrase is important, and I want you to hold on to that phrase. Here I am. There are moments in Scripture that you will hear this phrase, here I am. It happens when God is calling someone to do something new. Isaiah 6, he is caught up into the courts of heaven. He says, here I am, Lord, send me. After God asks, who will go to my people? Samuel, God keeps waking him up in dreams, and the priest tells him, say, here I am, Lord, I'm listening. And Revelation 6, there's this passage again, back up in heaven, here I am. There's others as well, but this is a significant phrase. God is looking for people to work through. And oh, that our attitudes would be, here I am. But hold on to that phrase like when you see it, and be like Abraham here. Here I am. And he's offering himself, like Abraham is like a sacrifice, saying, God, use me as you will. And that can mean scary things. Now let's make a few notes about this. One, this is not endorsing child or human sacrifice. I almost did not color code our sources today, but one reason that I did, if this was blue, if this was priestly, I would read it different than it was green. If this was priestly talking about sacrifice, I would think about animal sacrifice at the temple, but it's not, it's green. So this was written older when the Canaanites were around, when they did do human sacrifice. And so I'm reading this a little differently, because this is actually endorsing not to do human sacrifice. Because God intervenes when it happens and provides another way forward. Does that kind of make sense? So that context helps me shape a little bit about this. This is doing the opposite of endorsing human sacrifice. Because
Say that again, the Canaanites did have...
the Canaanites
so
did have...
within the general area, it was not like, I usually look at human sacrifice
The Aztecs or something.
differently. Yeah, exactly.
You would do it to conquered people, and you would do it to your kids. Multiple reasons. One, kids are expensive. You can't feed them. Might as well give them to the gods. Hopefully you get a blessing out of it.
Infanticide was very common.
Yeah.
The tribes in like South America, they could only feed so many people.
Yeah.
And someone got pregnant, said, well, we can't.
So might as well give them to God. So
One of the things, we're talking about the relationship between Abraham and God. What about the relationship between Abraham and Isaac?
well, we're going to see a little bit about this.
He didn't run away after he figured out what was going to happen.
Yeah.
He trusted his
Maybe remember Isaac and Rebekah, they're the golden people, they're the golden boys. We're seeing Isaac's faith too. Like we call this the testing of Abraham, it's also the testing of Isaac.
Yeah.
Isaac is old enough to carry wood. He's old enough to ask, hey, Dad, we do sacrifices with lambs. Where is the lamb? Yeah.
When
So
he
we're
tied
seeing-
him up, he was beginning to wonder, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Where's
Yeah.
the lamb?
And I will just go back and say, look up some Jewish commentaries on this story. A lot of Christian commentaries will just make this connection to Isaac as Jesus. And in both parallels, we see Isaac and Jesus are willing to go and be sacrificed. Something will happen about this. There's this idea of resurrection, or life will happen despite this. Some Christians will even say it happened on the same mountain. No, that's probably not true. But there's some parallels here we see with Jesus pointing back to this part with Isaac. I have a picture that will show us that in a moment. Let me just go back. This is not endorsing human sacrifice. It's the opposite. This is God stopping human sacrifice. I have a picture I want to look at here, or a couple of pictures. So this is a Christian one. This is a Christian one. So here's a little angel guy. You see him coming up to stop the blade. And here's Abraham. I don't know why he is just kind of kneeling down like this, but it looks like he's going to scalp him. And here's a ram back here. I feel like he should be tied up on an altar. Here's this Christian picture, and you'll notice in the Christian one, Isaac is younger in this. I find it fun to look at art and see people's interpretations because they're different. Sometimes they're older, sometimes younger. But you'll notice in both of these Christian pictures, there's that ram. So we get this idea God's providing. God's going to provide another way. In our Christian nature, we say that provision is Jesus. That there is blood that is shed and it gives life for sins, and Jesus is that provision to kind of share that life for everyone.
Where's the ram on the right side?
Way back there on the right.
Okay, the white.
Like back
Okay.
here.
I want to know how Abraham built that temple or that altar there. I mean, that looks man-made. You expect it just a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, well, look at his fire too. He's got some of that.
Yeah.
All of his twigs are nice and even as well. I really like this picture. This is a Greek icon. That's the servants that they left. Be an awkward conversation. They're like, they're going up there for a sacrifice and there's no ram. What's going on here? And but here we see Isaac carrying the wood. He's kind of a teenager in this picture. Oh, hey, John, look there. He's carrying some fire up. I guess he didn't have a flint and stone.
There you go.
And here he is again, going to scalp him or something. And there's a ram again, so we get this idea again. You'll notice in this picture that there's a tree right there. That's supposed to make you think of the cross when you see that.
It's an odd-looking tree. It's divided.
Because it's a cross.
Across.
Yeah.
Imagination.
So look up different Christian crosses. The one we have is called a towel cross, which is shaped like a T. But crosses, that's not the normal. There's an X cross. There's all these different shaped crosses. We're just used to only one. The towel cross is what we use. This is a Jewish painting of it. You can't really tell, but Isaac has a beard there. He's older. He's much older. And this one's taking place. And I put this in here because I just want to bring up Isaac is willing. And for Christians, when we read this story, we make these parallels to Jesus and about the provision of God through the Lamb. That provision is Jesus when we read it. But be like Isaac and be willing and trust God. And again, not endorsing human sacrifice. There's so much more that we could say about Isaac's story, but we have maybe tried to cover too much in one setting because it's already 12:50. So is there any questions or parts that stood out to you with Isaac?
I just thought it was amazing that he was willing to go along with his dad.
Yeah, and they both seem to know God would provide something. And again, those Jewish commentaries were that Isaac would be resurrected if he was to die. There is a genealogy insert here. It's just foreshadowing Rebecca. Here's a picture of it. So it lays out all of this stuff. So here's Terah, and he has a son Nahor. That's Abraham's brother, and that's where Rebecca comes from, and she's going to marry Isaac. One thing I didn't realize is that Rebecca and Laban are brother and sister. I did not know that, and that's who. If you remember, Jacob has to go work for 7 years for Laban, and he gives him the wrong sister. So he works another 7 years, and then he gets Rachel. And that's, But so that's what this genealogy is about. It's about putting us forward, like what's about to come up with these other patriarchs. And then we get into chapter 23, the death of Sarah. So first you'll notice it's blue. Most of what we've been reading is non-priestly. Suddenly there's something priestly here. The Hebrew in this is very different. It's very legalistic language. It's very contractual. And there's some significance to that. There's this courtly back and forth that's happening. Abraham is talking to Ephron, who is this guy who lives in Hebron. In the land of the Canaanites. It does say Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. So that's kind of special, I guess. But he's going here to bury Sarah. And there's some really big significance in this. So Hebron means the city of four. It would have been a Hittite city, even though the Hittites weren't actually here yet. And he comes here to purchase burial grounds for Sarah. So if you remember on our map, here's Hebron up there, where I was saying he was before, but I was mistaken. That's where he is going to bury Sarah. Some of the details, he pays 400 shekels, and there's this weird exchange. He's like, oh, I won't pay less. You can't give it to me. I'll pay the full price. 400 shekels was not the full price for a burial ground. This was the price of the king's ransom. They way overcharged him, and Abraham knows it, but he insists on paying that much. There is other ways that they're kind of taking advantage of Abraham in this exchange, and that tells us a few different things. In Hebron, they didn't do Abraham any favors. He earned his right to that land, and he purchases this land. And there's this really strict language that is used in the exchange. And it goes back to like we saw with that well. It's giving Abraham and then Abraham's ancestors a right to the land. And it is done very contractually and very enforced and in a lot of detail, which is why it's not that fun to read. And so when the conquest comes, they have a right, a divine right to this land because their ancestors are buried there. And if your ancestors are buried in a place, then that place is your place. There's also just some really strange language. They don't use the word like I'm buying this land. It's I'm buying this country, which is a strange phrase that stands out. And there's also some other things. They keep using the word Shema, which if you know any Jewish things, do you know what the Shema is? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. Hear is the Shema. That's how the 10 Commandments start, or the 10 words. Hear, listen, and that's the phrase that's used here. But that's like the most sacred text for Jews is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and that's the language that's used here. It's really strange. It's not. It's just weird language that happens here. But this is again about giving right to the land. So they belong here. They're not just foreigners in the land. They have a right to the land. And they weren't nice to Abraham. They took advantage of a grieving man, is the other idea that you get here. Here's a picture of it today. Here's Sarah's grave, or tomb cover. You can go see it in that building right there. And, I thought I had one more picture. Where'd it go?